That day dawned with a strange weight on Lucia's chest, as if her own body sensed something was about to break for good. She had spent the night awake, mentally replaying the countless times she had worked double shifts to cover the rent for Diego and Patricia's apartment, the grocery bags she carried herself, the electricity and water bills she never let fall behind. Meanwhile, in her own home, she deprived herself of basic necessities, saving even on bread. She did it all with the conviction that she was helping her son build a future, believing that one day this stage would end and he would appreciate every effort. It was that hope that kept her going, the pride of having raised her only son alone and wanting to see him happy. As evening fell, she decided to stop by the apartment unannounced, carrying a bag of fruit and freshly baked bread. She imagined Diego's warm smile upon seeing her arrive, that same expression that had so often brightened her childhood. However, what she found was a cold, distant atmosphere, as if her presence was in the way. Patricia looked her up and down with an impatient expression, and in the midst of superficial conversation, Lucia innocently asked when they were planning to get married. It was then that she heard the phrase that pierced her like a knife. "We got married yesterday, only for special people." The emotional blow was immediate. She felt the floor open beneath her feet. She, who had supported everything financially, had been excluded from the most important moment of her son's life. The walk home that night was silent and heavy. Lucia walked with her bag almost untouched in her hand, not even remembering when she had left the apartment. Each step was a mixture of anger, sadness, and a feeling of emptiness that was difficult to describe. Patricia's words echoed in her head, repeated over and over again like a cruel echo. It wasn't just her exclusion from the ceremony. It was the certainty of having been used, of having become a kind of ATM disguised as a mother. The pain came not only from her daughter-in-law's contempt, but from Diego's indifference, who didn't utter a single word in her defense. For the next few days, Lucia barely ate. She spent hours sitting in the living room, looking at old photographs where Diego appeared smiling on birthdays, at school, and on the simple Christmases they shared. In each image, she saw the boy she had promised never to abandon, and she felt that now he was the one who had left her aside. She cried silently, trying to understand when the mother-son relationship had transformed into a bond of debt and obligation. After so much sleeplessness and anguish, she made a decision that seemed as painful as it was necessary: to cut off all financial support. She cancelled transfers, blocked access to accounts, and promised herself never to sustain the life they led at the cost of their own sacrifice. The silence that followed that decision didn't last long. At first, Diego didn't call, and Lucia thought maybe he'd understood. But soon the insistent calls began, along with reproachful messages and manipulative phrases meant to make her feel guilty. Patricia, with a feigned, affectionate tone, appeared at her door with rehearsed tears, talking about second chances and the importance of a united family. However, her mask quickly fell. In a matter of minutes, she went from pleading to threatening, saying that Lucia was acting like a spoiled child and that with her attitude, she was destroying her own son's life. The wound deepened when Diego, burdened by credit card debt, shamelessly admitted that much of his mother's money had been spent on luxuries, restaurants, trips, designer clothes. Nothing about necessities, as he had so often claimed. For Lucia, hearing this confirmed what she had already suspected deep down. This wasn't temporary help or support to support the couple. It was pure abuse. That revelation finally broke what little remained standing. It was no longer just the pain of exclusion. It was the certainty of having been deliberately deceived by the person she loved most in the world. The situation escalated even further when Patricia's mother, Marlene, appeared at Lucia's house. She arrived with a calculated smile, talking about resolving misunderstandings, as if it were all just a family argument. For a few minutes, she feigned concern, but soon made it clear what she had come for: to pressure Lucia to resume financing. The marriage, she disguised it as advice, even hinting that Lucia might no longer be fully capable of managing her own money. This blatant manipulation set off all of Lucia's alarm bells. For the first time, she understood that she wasn't dealing with an isolated problem with Diego and Patricia, but rather a broader strategy in which her daughter-in-law's entire family was seeking to take advantage of her. That night, Lucia barely slept, but instead of remaining paralyzed, she woke up with renewed determination. The next day, she sought legal advice and met Dr. Henrique, a lawyer who listened patiently and clearly explained that what she was experiencing had a name: financial abuse against an elderly person. With his help, she began organizing her defense. She changed passwords, locked access, modified her will, and began recording every suspicious interaction. As she took these steps, she also saw how the couple reacted furiously. They tried to construct a narrative in which Lucia appeared as a confused elderly woman, repeating rumors in the neighborhood and even attempting to involve social workers to question her mental capacity. The hardest blow came when Lucia received the court notification. Diego had requested her interdiction, arguing that she suffered from dementia and couldn't manage her assets. Reading her name as the plaintiff on that document was like feeling a stab. It wasn't a rumor, it wasn't a threat uttered in a moment of rage, it was her own son, trying to legally take away her autonomy. The betrayal reached a level she could never have imagined. For hours she sat with the paper in her hands, unable to cry, unable to scream, only a mixture of disbelief and emptiness. The day of the hearing was one of the most tense of her life. She entered the courtroom with her heart racing, accompanied by Dr. Henrique and carrying the recent medical reports certifying her lucidity. Upon seeing her, Diego avoided meeting her gaze. Patricia, on the other hand, held her head high, as if confident of a victory that no longer depended on them. But when the time came to present evidence, everything changed. The documents clearly showed that Lucia was in perfect health, while the bank transfers and expense records exposed the couple's abusive financial dependence. The judge, serious, recognized that it was an attempt at fraud and not only rejected the interdiction, but also ordered an investigation into Diego and Patricia. Leaving that courtroom was a huge relief, but also a feeling of emptiness that was difficult to describe. Lucia had won the legal battle, yes, but she had lost something that no ruling could restore: her trust in her own son. The image of Diego signing that interdiction order remained etched like a scar in her memory. Even if the judge had acknowledged the truth, she knew nothing would ever be the same. There was no celebration possible, only a bitter feeling of having to defend herself against the person to whom she had given the most in her life. In the following days, Lucia decided to cut loose from everything that bound her to that period of grief. She sold the house where she had raised Diego, every corner filled with memories that were now unbearable, and bought a small apartment in the city center. The change of scenery was like opening a window after years of stale air. Little by little, she began to rebuild her own routines. She enrolled in a painting class, dared to travel alone for the first time, and even discovered the sea, something she had always dreamed of but had never allowed herself. With each step, she felt she was regaining not only her financial freedom, but also her dignity as a woman and as a person. In the midst of this new life, Lucia began to connect with a group of older women who had also experienced domestic abuse. Some had been evicted from their homes by children or siblings. Others had been manipulated into signing documents they didn't understand. Hearing these stories opened her eyes even further. What she had experienced was not an isolated case, but a silent reality that many carried in secret. With them, she found a safe space where she could speak without fear of judgment, where tears were understood and resilience was celebrated. This support network became a fundamental part of her healing process. Encouraged by these shared experiences, Lucia decided to take a step further. With the help of her lawyer and some friends, she created a small support fund for older women victims of financial exploitation. It wasn't something large or formal at first, but it served to provide guidance, pay for legal consultations, or even cover basic expenses until the women could regain control of their assets. This initiative gave her a new purpose. She no longer saw herself as the humiliated mother who had been excluded from her son's marriage, but as a woman capable of transforming her pain into strength for others. Every time someone called her gratefully, Lucia felt she was finally writing a new chapter in her life. 2 years after all that chaos, an unexpected doorbell rang at her apartment door. When she opened it, Lucia found Diego, visibly thinner, with a tired face and a look that mixed shame and pleading. Months had passed without any contact, and now he was there asking to talk. With a broken voice, he acknowledged that his marriage to Patricia was over and that, in the midst of that collapse, he had realized the damage he had caused his mother. He said he was seeking forgiveness, although Lucia sensed that what he really asked for was a new opportunity to rebuild a bond he himself had destroyed. Lucia listened to him in silence, her heart torn between her maternal instinct and the memory of every wound that still ached. She didn't throw him out, but she didn't embrace him as she would have done before either. Calmly, she made it clear that she would only accept a relationship based on respect and without financial dependency. There would be no more transfers, no more rent payments, no more covered bills. If he wanted to be present in her life, he had to do so as a responsible, adult son, not as someone who saw her as a resource. Diego nodded with tears in his eyes, understanding that this wasn't a closed door, but rather a boundary he should never cross again. Over time, Lucia began to understand that her greatest victory hadn't been in court or in that final conversation with Diego. Her true triumph lay in breaking the chain of submission that had kept her from sacrificing herself without limits for years. She remembered how, in the past, she had justified every expense, every personal sacrifice, as if it were only natural to bear the burden. Now, however, she could say she had learned to say a firm and necessary no. This inner change was what gave her peace when she looked back, because she understood she had regained something much more valuable than money: her dignity. Her days no longer revolved around other people's bills or the anxiety of being indispensable to supporting a home that wasn't her own. Now she spent her mornings painting, an activity that relaxed her and eventually became a new passion. She spent her afternoons volunteering with children at a community daycare, where she felt her love found a clean and sincere place. And from time to time, she organized short trips with her new friends, women who, like her, had endured family storms and rebuilt themselves from the ground up. In these shared experiences, she found confirmation that it's never too late to start over. Sometimes on quiet nights, Lucia thought about the past and was surprised by how clearly she saw everything now. She remembered in detail the times when, exhausted after cleaning other people's houses, she would run to the supermarket to fill Diego and Patricia's bags. She also remembered how she hadn't bought a new coat for herself because they had to pay their car payment. And when she relived those scenes, what she felt wasn't hatred, but a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for having allowed so much, and relief for having had the strength to set a limit in time. In those reflections, She understood that the manipulation had been as subtle as it was constant. Patricia, with her authoritarian tone, treated her like an employee, and Diego, little by little, adopted the same detachment. Now, looking back, she saw the clear signs she'd previously ignored. The demands, disguised as requests, the silences laced with contempt, the indifference to her own sacrifices. It was painful to admit, but necessary to never repeat it again. That's why, every time she spoke with other women in the support group, she insisted that it's not just about giving, but about learning to take care of yourself. One day, during a support group meeting, Lucia shared her full story for the first time, from the sacrifices of her youth to the court hearing. As she spoke, she noticed several women nodding their heads, recognizing themselves in her words. When she finished, there was a brief silence, followed by applause and heartfelt hugs. It was at that moment that she understood the true power of sharing her experiences. It not only served as a way to vent, but also to give strength to others still trapped in abusive dynamics. That feeling of transforming pain into something useful gave new meaning to everything she had been through. Over time, that same meeting grew into a larger and more organized space. Thanks to the perseverance of Lucia and other colleagues, the support fund grew, and they began working with volunteer professionals, psychologists, young lawyers, social workers. What had begun as a group of women sharing experiences transformed into a project that offered concrete tools so that others wouldn't repeat the same story. Each step was a reminder for Lucia that while she couldn't erase the past, she could use it as a driving force to build something valuable. There was a special moment that marked a turning point in her recovery, the day she traveled alone to the sea for the first time. She was 68 years old and had never felt the sand beneath her feet or the sound of the waves so close. She walked slowly along the shore, breathing deeply, and thought about everything she had endured for decades. Feeling the salty breeze was like a physical reminder that she still had much more to live for. She cried, yes, but they were different. Tears, tears of liberation. That trip became a personal symbol, confirmation that there is always time to start over. After that trip, Lucia began to indulge in small pleasures she'd previously considered an impossible luxury. She bought clothes without waiting for gifts, went out to eat without counting every penny, and filled her apartment with plants that she lovingly tended. What for many were everyday details, for her meant achievements. Each gesture was a way of reminding herself that her life no longer revolved around the needs of others, but around her own desires. This transformation didn't erase the past, but it gave her back the feeling of being in control of her present. Sometimes, Diego tried to reconnect with small gestures, a message on important dates, a brief call to check on her. Lucia responded politely, but kept her distance. She'd learned that she couldn't allow guilt to trap her again. Broken trust isn't rebuilt with a few words, and she needed to protect the peace she'd worked so hard to achieve. Still, she didn't completely close the door. She understood that each person has their own journey, and if Diego wanted to demonstrate real change, he would have to do it with actions, not empty promises. Meanwhile, Patricia disappeared completely from her life. She learned from other people's comments that she'd been experiencing serious financial problems and that her ostentatious lifestyle had collapsed. Lucia felt neither resentment nor joy about this, simply indifference. She understood that wasting energy on someone who had caused her so much harm was wasting valuable time. She no longer needed revenge or explanations. All she wanted was to move forward with the peace of mind she'd built. That indifference, paradoxically, was one of her greatest achievements because it showed that she was no longer trapped in anger or resentment. One day, during one of her painting classes, the teacher suggested that each student create a work depicting a defining moment in their lives. Lucia took up her brush and, almost without thinking, painted a small house surrounded by shadows, with a woman stepping through the door into an open sky. When she finished, she realized that the image was her own story. The woman was her, leaving behind the weight of abuse and walking toward freedom. She was overcome with emotion, and although she had never considered herself an artist, the painting became a kind of mirror of her rebirth. That painting ended up hanging in the living room of her apartment, and every visitor who looked at it asked her about its meaning. Lucia used it as a starting point to describe in broad strokes what she had experienced. She wasn't seeking compassion, but rather to show that it was possible to escape abusive situations, even if they seemed endless. For her, talking about the past no longer meant reliving the wound, but rather reaffirming the strength with which she had learned to say enough. She discovered that sharing her experience not only helped others, it also helped her remember to never again allow someone to treat her as a disposable resource. As the months passed, Lucia also reconciled with a part of herself she had neglected for years. The woman who had the right to enjoy herself, to laugh, to make mistakes without always shouldering everyone's responsibility. She started listening to music again while cooking, allowed herself to dance alone in the living room, and even started going out with new friends on short trips. She rediscovered what it was like to feel light without the constant burden of solving other people's problems. This rediscovery didn't come all at once, but gradually, until one day she noticed she was no longer constantly waiting on her phone or anyone's demands. On one of those trips, she met Carmen, a woman her age who had gone through a divorce filled with betrayal and loss. They became fast friends, sharing long, heartfelt conversations in which they found mutual recognition. With Carmen, she understood that she was not alone in her experience, that many women of her generation had lived silent sacrifices. That friendship became a refuge, but also a mirror. Together, they encouraged each other to never again allow anyone to make them feel less than. For Lucia, it was another reminder that life, even after so much betrayal, could offer new beginnings. Over time, the most painful memories stopped appearing every day and transformed into scars that no longer bled. Lucia understood that the past couldn't be erased, but it could be redefined. Every time she saw her reflection in the mirror, she recognized herself as someone who had been through the worst and come out on top with her head held high. It wasn't about denying the pain, but rather accepting it as part of the story that had made her stronger. That acceptance gave her serenity, a peace she had never felt while living under the emotional and financial blackmail of Diego and Patricia. At one of her support group meetings, an older woman approached her and told her that her testimony had given her the strength to report her own son. Lucia hugged her, a lump in her throat, and she understood the full extent of her experience. It wasn't just her life that had changed. She was also helping others dare to defend themselves. That feeling of having transformed pain into hope was, perhaps, the greatest reparation she could find. Unlike the trial, where there had been a legal ruling, here there was a human recognition that filled a deeper void. One day, while watering the plants on her balcony, Lucia received a call from Diego. This time, he wasn't asking for money or favors, he just wanted to know how she was. His voice sounded more mature, filled with a humility she'd never known before. She listened silently, answered calmly, and when she hung up, she felt that he wasn't hurting like he had before. There had been a change in him, perhaps real, perhaps belated, but the important thing was that she no longer depended on that bond to feel fulfilled. That moment confirmed that a cycle had come to a close. She could talk to her son without feeling as if her life was in his hands. With that certainty, Lucia began to plan her future differently. She didn't think about the lost time or the wounds she'd been left with, but about the years she still had ahead of her. She wanted to continue painting, traveling, helping other women, and above all, living with the freedom she'd worked so hard to gain. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the used and discarded mother, but a woman who had learned to pick herself up after the harshest humiliation. That new outlook was, in itself, the greatest proof of her overcoming difficulties. Today, by sharing her story in this space, Lucia does so with the hope that others will understand that it's never too late to set a boundary and regain one's dignity. It doesn't matter if betrayal comes from the least expected person. There's always the possibility of saying enough is enough and starting over. She, who once felt humiliated and reduced to a mere source of income, now lives with the certainty that her worth doesn't depend on anyone's approval. Her final message is clear. Freedom begins when one stops justifying oneself and learns to take care of oneself without fear or guilt.